Chapter 1. The Accent of Silence. In the hierarchy of St. Jude's Academy, scent was supposed to be the ultimate truth. Alphas smelled of cedar, ozone, and thunder, aggressive markers of dominance. Omegas were soft drifts of vanilla or citrus. Then, Brandon didn't smell like an invitation. He smelled like chilled jasmine and high-altitude air. It was a scent that didn't ask for your attention. It commanded your lungs to stop. I was 17 the first time I realized I was in trouble. I was sitting 3 rows behind him in advanced calculus, watching the sunlight catch the silver clip in his hair, while the other alphas in the room were busy posturing, trying to fill the space with their musk. I was trying to breathe as shallowly as possible. I didn't want to disturb the air he occupied. I was the scholarship. Contradiction in terms. In this world, an alpha without a trust fund was just a well-built tool. I knew my place. Keep my head down, keep my grades at the top of the curve, and never ever look at the sun. But Brandon, the sun. The afternoon of the incident started like any other. The humidity was thick, making the school corridors feel claustrophobic. I was heading to the library when Julian and his circle of high-born alphas intercepted me. "Hey Leo, calculating the interest on your student loans?" Julian, blocking the hallway, tightened on my bag. "Just trying to get to class, Julian. You're always just doing something," he mocked, stepping closer. "Just studying, just working, just staring at Brandon's back during lunch. We see you, scholar. We see the way you look at the heir to the Brandon group." My heart hammered it against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. If they knew I was dead, socially, academically, perhaps even physically. In their eyes, my attraction wasn't a crush. It was an act of class warfare. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice tight. "Oh, please, you're practically vibrating every time he walks past. What's the end goal? A fairy tale? The poor buries the prince and saves his family from the slums?" I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Brandon had stopped at his locker just 10 feet away. He was still, his back to us, but I knew he could hear every word. "Alphas don't whisper," and Julian was shouting. Panic was a cold tide rising in my throat. I had to kill the rumor. I had to bury it so deep it would never see the light of day. "Someone like him?" I snapped, the words tumbling out before my brain could vet them. I forced a laugh, a dry, jagged sound that hurt my throat. "Never. I'm here for a degree, not a trophy husband who thinks the world revolves around his pedigree." I didn't stop there. I couldn't. The adrenaline was a liar. "He's untouchable because he's cold." "Julian, why would I want to spend my life trying to thaw out someone who doesn't even know how to smile? He's not my type, not even close." The silence that followed was a physical blow. Julian's smirk vanished. His eyes flicked behind me, widening in a mix of shock and twisted glee. I felt the temperature drop. The jasmine in the air didn't just sharpen, it froze. It became a blade. I turned slowly. Brandon was standing there. He hadn't moved much, but his hand was white-knuckled on the edge of his locker door. He didn't look angry. Anger would have been easier to handle. He looked hollow. For one heartbeat, our eyes met. Those pale, crystalline eyes that I had dreamed about. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to tell him that I was lying, that I was a coward, that he was the only thing I saw when I closed my eyes. But Brandon spoke first. Or rather, he didn't. He simply closed his locker. The thud of the metal door sounded like a gunshot in the empty hall. He walked past us, his shoulder brushing mine. For a fraction of a second, I felt the radiating heat of him, and then he was gone, leaving nothing but the bitter, dying scent of jasmine in his wake. "Well," Julian whispered, sounding impressed, "I guess that settles that." I stood there, backpack head, my dignity intact, and my soul suddenly violently empty. I had survived the afternoon, but as I watched Brandon disappear around the corner, I realized I had just spent the only currency I ever truly had. His curiosity. 10 years later, the invitation sat on my desk like a legal summons. My father, a man who viewed his children as assets to be traded, stood by the window of his office. He had lost the family firm's liquidity in a series of bad gambles. Now, he was looking for a bailout. "The Brandons have agreed to honor the old pact," he said, his back to me. "Their grandfather was fond of yours. They want stability. They want a partner they can control." I looked at the name on the gold-embossed card. "Brandon." He agreed. I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "He's an omega of a certain age. Leo, he has a company to run and a reputation to maintain. He needs an alpha who won't embarrass him. You're a scholarship boy with a clean record and a predictable face." My father turned, a cruel smile on his face. "Besides, I made it worth their while. I made it very clear that our cooperation in the upcoming merger comes at a price. A steep one." I felt a chill. "You asked for money?" "I asked for what we are owed. Now, sign the papers. You've wanted him since you were 17. Don't pretend you're a martyr now." Picked up the pen. My hand trembled, but my heart was screaming. I thought of that hallway. I thought of the 10 years I'd spent trying to become a man worthy of the jasmine scent. I thought maybe this is how I fix it. Maybe if I'm his husband, I can finally tell him the truth. I signed my name. I didn't know that on the other side of the city, Brandon was looking at the same contract, his eyes cold and full of a hatred that had been simmering for a decade. To me, this a second chance. To him, this was a bill that had finally come due. Chapter 2. The Cold Radiance. The wedding was a performance in high definition. Every camera flash felt like a needle prick. I stood at the altar, my spine rigid, the heavy fabric of my tuxedo feeling like a suit of armor I hadn't earned. When the massive doors of the cathedral swung open, the air didn't just move, it died. Brandon walked down the aisle like he was marching toward a firing squad. He was breathtaking. His veil was a mist of silk, and his suit was ivory, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. But as he drew closer, I didn't smell the joy of a mate. I smelled winter. The jasmine was there, but it was buried under a layer of frost so thick it made my own alpha instincts want to tuck tail and run. When he reached me, he didn't look at my face. He looked at my tie. "Don't touch my hand longer than necessary," he whispered, his voice a ghost of a serrated edge. The priest spoke of ancient bonds and the joining of two great houses. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell the 500 guests that this wasn't a union, it was a hostile takeover. When I slid the ring onto his finger, his skin was so cold I flinched. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the gold band as if it were a shackle. The penthouse was a tomb of glass and marble. It was 2 a.m. The gala was over. The happy couple had been toasted with vintage champagne that tasted like vinegar in my mouth. Now we were alone in the silence of a $30 million cage. I stood in the center of the living room, watching Brandon. He had already shed his suit jacket, tossing it onto a designer chair with a carelessness that screamed of his exhaustion. He began unbuttoning his silk shirt, his movements sharp and jerky. "Brandon," I started, my voice cracking the silence. We should talk about how we're going to do this." He stopped, his hand pausing on the third button. He turned his head, his profile silhouetted against the city lights. "How we're going to do what, Leo? Play house? Or do you want to discuss the schedule for when you'll be requesting your allowance from my accountants?" The words hit me like a physical blow. "My allowance? What are you talking about?" Brandon turned fully now, his eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "Let's drop the scholarship Alpha Act. I know about the direct investment your father negotiated. I know that for the privilege of having you in my bed, my family is essentially financing your father's failing construction firm for the next 5 years." He walked toward me, each step deliberate. He stopped just inches away, and for the first time in 10 years, I was forced to look into the depths of his resentment. "You said never, remember?" Brandon's voice was a low, dangerous purr. "In that hallway, you said you had too much dignity to chase a trophy husband. I suppose everyone has a price, and yours just happened to be a 9-figure bailout." "Brandon, I didn't know about the money," I said, my heart thundering. "I signed because I thought we were reviving the pact. I thought maybe you wanted this. I wanted to save my grandfather's legacy." Brandon snapped, his scent suddenly flaring, a sharp, stinging jasmine that made my eyes water. "He built this empire with and he was dying. He begged me to make sure the families didn't drift apart. He didn't know he was asking me to buy a man who once mocked me in front of the whole school." I reached out, my hand hovering near his arm. "I was a kid, Brandon. I was terrified of how much I liked you, and I said something stupid to survive. I've regretted it every day for a decade." Brandon looked at my hand as if it were a poisonous snake. Don't you dare try to rewrite history with sentimentality." He stepped back, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. "You want to live here? Fine. This is the arrangement. You will work at the company. I want you, can see you. I want to know exactly what you're planning and who you're talking to. You will have your own room. You will not touch me. You will not scent me. And in public, you will be the perfect, supportive alpha." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled my marrow. "You sold yourself to me, and I am a very demanding owner. Get used to the cold." He turned and walked toward the master suite, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. I stood in the dark, the scent of bitter jasmine clinging to my skin. I looked down at my wedding ring. It glittered under the recessed lighting, beautiful and hollow. I had finally gotten what I wanted. I was his husband. But as I walked toward the guest room, carrying my own suitcase, I realized that I wasn't his partner. I was his penance. Chapter 3. The Glass Panopticon. The headquarters of Brandon Group was a monolith of chrome and ego, a 90-story spire that dominated the skyline. For Brandon, it was his throne room. For me, it was a glass panopticon. I had been assigned the role of senior strategic consultant. On paper, it sounded prestigious. In reality, my office was located directly adjacent to Brandon's, separated by a single wall of smart glass that he could turn transparent with a single tap on his tablet. He wanted me visible. He wanted me contained. I sat at my desk, the air around me smelling of sanitized air conditioning and the faint, lingering trace of the coffee I'd had for breakfast alone. My job was a relentless stream of data analysis and market projections, tasks more than capable. But every time I looked up, I felt the weight of his gaze. The glass wall shimmered and cleared. Brandon was sitting at his desk, a sleek slab of obsidian. He didn't look up from his monitor, but I saw his jaw tighten. He was wearing a slate-gray suit that made him look like a storm cloud. I tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, the alpha in me screaming. An alpha is supposed to provide. He is supposed to protect. Here, I was a decorative plant with a high IQ. A buzzer sounded on my desk. "Leo, my office." Now Brandon's voice came through the intercom, devoid of any inflection. I stood up, smoothed my tie, the one he'd looked at with such disdain on our wedding night, and walked the 10 paces to his door. Inside, the scent of jasmine was muted, suppressed by the sheer force of his professional persona. He didn't invite me to sit. "The Q3 projections for the logistics," Brandon said, tossing a folder onto the desk. "You flagged the overseas shipping costs as a volatility risk. Explain." I took a breath. Stepping into the role I actually knew how to play. The fuel surcharges in the Baltic region are projected to rise by 12% due to the new emissions treaties. If we lock in the current vendors, we're essentially subsidizing their transition to green energy at our own expense. We should pivot to the Mediterranean rail lines. Brandon finally looked up. His eyes searched mine, looking for the lie. He was searching for the ambitious social climber he believed I was. He wanted to find a flaw in my logic that pointed toward me trying to embezzle or manipulate the company. "You're suggesting we abandon a 10-year partnership with the Nordics because of a 12% fluctuation?" "I'm suggesting we prioritize the company's bottom line over a sentimental contract." Countered, my voice steady. "Isn't that the theme of our marriage, Brandon? Efficiency over sentiment?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Brandon's eyes narrowed. "Don't get clever, Leo. You're here to crunch numbers, not to give me philosophy lessons." "Then why am I really here?" I stepped closer to the desk, ignoring the warning growl in my own chest. "You have 50 analysts who could have told you about the fuel surcharges. You brought me here so you could watch me. You're waiting for me to fail. You're waiting for me to prove you right, that I'm just a scholarship kid with a hand out." Brandon stood up. He was shorter than me, but the sheer intensity of his omega presence was a physical force. "I brought you here because I don't trust you. I don't trust your father, and I don't trust the man who told a hallway full of people that I was nothing to him, only to turn around and sign a marriage certificate the moment the price was right." He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from me. "Every success you have in this office, I see as a calculation. Every brilliant idea is just you trying to dig your claws deeper into my family's wealth. You think you're proving your worth. You're just proving how much you're willing to perform for a paycheck." I felt the sting of it, the sheer, blinding unfairness. I had worked 3 jobs in college to keep my father's house from being foreclosed. I had studied until my eyes bled to earn a place in this world. "I don't want your money, Brandon," I whispered. "I never did." "Then give it back," he snapped. "Dowry, the investment in your father's firm. Return it all, and maybe I'll believe you." "Can't he already spent?" Brandon's laugh was a cold, jagged thing. "Exactly. So keep working, Leo. Keep being the perfect, efficient husband. It's what I paid for." He turned his back on me, a dismissal as brutal as a physical blow. I walked back to my office, the smart glass frosting over as I entered, shielding me from his view. I sat down and put my head in my hands. The scent of jasmine was faint on my sleeves, a lingering ghost from when I'd stood too close to him. I realized then that it didn't matter if I was a genius, didn't matter if I saved his company millions. In his eyes, I was a debt that would never be paid off. I looked at the gold ring on my finger. It felt like it was getting tighter, choking out of my hand. I had been his husband for 3 months. I didn't know how I was going to survive the next 30 years. Chapter 4. The fracture in the ice. The rain in the city wasn't a cleanse, it was a blur. It turned the neon lights of the business district into jagged streaks of oil on the pavement. Inside the Brandon Group Tower, the atmosphere was even grimmer. We had been in a deadlock for 6 hours. A hostile takeover bid from a rival conglomerate had sent the board into a frenzy, and Brandon was at the center of the storm, his scent turning from chilled jasmine to something sharp, like ozone before a lightning strike. I stood in the corner of the boardroom, my role reduced to observer. Every time I tried to offer a counter-strategy, Brandon's eyes would flick to me cold, dismissive and silent. He was drowning in the pressure, but his pride was a life jacket made of lead. He would rather sink than let me pull him to the surface. When the meeting finally adjourned at 11 p.m., the tension in the room didn't dissipate, it just condensed. "Go home, Leo," Brandon said, not looking at me as he shoved his laptop into his bag. His hands were trembling just a fraction, but to an alpha's heightened senses, it was like a tectonic shift. "You're exhausted," I said, stepping toward him. "You shouldn't drive in this. Let me take the wheel. I don't need a driver, I don't need a consultant, and I certainly don't need you," he snapped. He finally looked at me, and the exhaustion in his eyes was heartbreaking. There were dark circles under his lashes, and his usual pristine composure was fraying at the edges. "I'm going to my grandfather's estate. I need air that isn't tainted by this office, or by you, Bren." He brushed past me, his scent a jagged spike of distress that he was trying desperately to mask. I watched him go, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut. I stood there for a moment, the silence of the boardroom ringing in my ears. My instinct, the one I had tried to suppress for months, was screaming at me, "Follow him." I ran for the elevators. By the time I reached the parking garage, I saw his silver coupe tearing toward the exit, the tires screeching on the wet concrete. I jumped into my own car and followed, my heart a rhythmic thud against my ribs. The highway was a death trap. The rain was coming down in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. I could see Brandon's taillights ahead of me, two red eyes in the dark, dancing dangerously close to the edge of the lane. He was driving too fast, venting his frustration into the accelerator. I tried to call him. Once, twice, 10 times. He didn't pick up. We hit the bridge over the river, a high, exposed stretch of road where the wind whipped the rain into a frenzy. I saw his brake lights flash sudden, panicked. A truck ahead had hydroplaned, jackknifing across 3 lanes. Brandon slammed on his brakes. I saw his car fishtail, the back end swinging out like a pendulum. "Brandon!" I screamed, though there was no one to hear me. His car hit the guardrail, the sound of tearing metal screaming over the thunder. It spun once, twice, and then slammed sideways into a concrete pillar. The world went silent. I threw my car into park and sprinted into the rain, the freezing water soaking through my suit in seconds. My alpha instincts were in a total, primal riot. I reached his car, the driver's side was crumpled, the glass shattered into a million glittering diamonds on the asphalt. Brandon, look at me." I ripped the door open, the metal groaning. He was slumped against the steering wheel, a thin trail of blood tracing a path from his temple down his pale cheek. The scent of jasmine was there, but it was weak, fading like a dying candle. "Please," I whispered, my hands shaking as I checked for a pulse. "I found it. But there, please leave me like this, not with everything left unsaid." 2 weeks later, the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and artificial flowers. I hadn't slept in 48 hours. I sat in the chair by the bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Brandon's chest. The doctors had said the physical injuries were stable, but the head trauma was the wild card. He had been drifting in and out of a medically induced coma. I was holding his hand. It was the first time I had touched him without him pulling away in months. His skin was finally warm. His fingers twitched. I sat up, my heart leaping. "Brandon?" His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, searching the ceiling before they finally landed on me. For a long moment, he just looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. I prepared myself for the coldness. I prepared for the "why are you here?" and the "let go of my hand." Instead, a small, tentative smile touched his lips. "Leo," he whispered. His voice was raspy, but it lacked the serrated edge of the last decade. "I'm here," I said, my voice thick. "I'm right here." He squeezed my hand, not a light squeeze, a desperate one. "I had a dream," he murmured, his eyes focusing on me with a terrifyingly soft intensity. "I dreamed we were still at school. You were in the library, and I was waiting for you to look up." My breath hitched. "Brandon, do you know where you are?" He looked around the room, then back at me. He looked at the gold band on my finger, then at the matching one on his own. His eyes widened, but not with horror. They filled with a dawning, radiant joy. "We did it?" he asked, his voice breathless. "We actually got married?" I froze. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "You don't remember?" I asked carefully. Brandon laughed softly. a sound I hadn't heard in 10 years. I remember everything, Leo. I remember the way you used to hide in the back of the classroom. I remember how much I wanted to talk to you, but I was too proud to be the first one to move. He reached up, his fingers brushing my jaw, trailing over the stubble I hadn't bothered to shave. I thought I'd lost my chance after high school. He whispered, "But you're here. You're my husband." He looked me up and down, a shamelessly appreciative gleam in his eyes, a look I had never once received from the real Brandon. "My taste," he murmured, pulling me closer until our foreheads touched, "is absolutely excellent." I felt my heart stop, then shatter, then restart. He didn't remember the hallway. He didn't remember the money. He didn't remember the divorce papers sitting in his desk drawer. In his head, we were two people who had finally found their way to each other. I knew I should tell him. I knew I should call the doctor, but as he leaned forward and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my temple, the first kiss he had ever given me of his own free will, I closed my eyes. I was a liar. I was a coward. For the first time in my life, the jasmine smelled like spring. Chapter 5. The shameless shadow. The medical term was retrograde amnesia, but to me it felt like a glitch in the universe. A door had opened into the past, skipping over a decade of thorns and landing us back in the garden. The doctor explained that Brandon had lost the last few years of emotional baggage. He remembered who he was, he remembered the company, and he remembered me. But he remembered me through the lens of a pining teenager who had finally won the prize. The Ice Queen hadn't just thawed, he had evaporated. I was in the middle of a high-stakes briefing with the head of logistics when the door to my office swung open. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of jasmine, warm, sun-drenched and heavy, flooded the room. Brandon didn't wait for an invitation. He walked past the stunned department head and hopped onto the corner of my desk, his legs swinging. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater instead of his usual armored suits. "We're in a meeting, Brandon," I said, my voice hovering between an admonishment and a plea. My heart, as usual, was doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. "I can see that," Brandon said, leaning over at my monitor. He smelled like the expensive soap from our bathroom and himself, that intoxicating omega heat he used to suppress with scent blockers. Now he radiated it like a space heater. "But you've been in here for 3 hours. If you're my husband, I have rights. One of them is seeing your face before the sun goes down." The department head cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at the CEO sitting on a desk like a college student. I'll send the rest of the report via encrypted mail, Mr. Rossi." The man scrambled. As soon as the door clicked shut, Brandon's playful expression softened into something more predatory, more affectionate. He reached out, his fingers hooking into my tie and pulling me forward until I was forced to stand between his knees. "You're working too hard," he murmured, his eyes scanning my face with a hunger that made me dizzy. "Are you trying to impress me? Because it's working. But I'd be more impressed if you came home and let me cook for you." "You don't know how to, Brandon," I reminded him, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth despite the guilt gnawing at my gut. "The last time you tried toast, you set off the smoke alarm." "Details," he dismissed, leaning in until his nose brushed mine. He took a deep, shaky breath, scenting my neck. "You smell like cedar and old paper." I missed it. "I was gone for 45 minutes, I whispered. "Too long." He was shamelessly attached. He followed me to the break room. He waited outside the restroom. He's in the back of a meeting, staring at me with such blatant pride that the board members began to whisper about newlywed bliss. But it was in the elevators where he was the most dangerous. We were descending to the lobby after a long day when the doors slid shut, leaving us alone in the mirrored box. Brandon immediately backed me into the corner, his hands flat against the glass on either side of my head. "You're too handsome today," he grumbled, his voice low and vibrating with a strange, possessive edge. "I saw the way that new intern was looking at you." "I don't like it," I laughed, the sound breathless. "Brandon, I didn't even notice the intern." "I did." He leaned in, his lips grazing my jawline. "I should mark you properly, so everyone knows exactly who you belong to." The alpha in me surged at the suggestion, a primal, ancient urge to claim and be claimed. I had to remind myself that this Brandon didn't know we had already filed for divorce. He didn't know he was supposed to hate me. "Brandon, wait," I said, gently catching his wrists. "Are you sure about this? You've been so different since the accident." Pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. Playfulness was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly sincere clarity. "I know I'm different," he said quietly. "I feel like I woke up from a long, cold dream. Everything before the accident is foggy, but when I see you, the fog clears. You're the only thing that feels real. Leo, if I met you again 1,000 times, in 1,000 different lives, I'd still choose you." He leaned forward and kissed me. It wasn't a polite, transactional kiss. It was deep, desperate, and tasted of second chances. For a moment, I let myself believe the lie. I wrapped my arms around his waist, pulling him flush against me, and let the scent of jasmine drown out the memory of the cold. When we broke apart, he was flushed, his eyes dark with a heat that promised a very different night than the ones we'd spent in separate wings of the penthouse. "I love you," he whispered against my lips. "Say it properly." My chest ached. The truth was a stone in my throat. The lie was a balm on my soul. "I love you, Brandon," I said, and for the first in my life, I didn't have to wonder if he heard me. I believed was our future. I believed I could keep the world at bay forever. I didn't know that in a drawer at the estate, private investigator's report was waiting for him, and I didn't know that inside Brandon, a new life was already beginning to take root. A secret that even he didn't know he was carrying. Chapter 6, The Territorial Line. The spring of our marriage was beautiful, but it was also volatile. In his amnesiac state, Brandon had lost the filters that high society had spent years building around him. He didn't care about decorum or the composed omega archetype. To him, the world was simple. I was his alpha, and anything that threatened that connection was an enemy to be neutralized. His jealousy wasn't the petty kind. It was explosive. Primal. It was as if his subconscious was overcompensating for the years he'd spent pushing me away. The occasion was the annual Founders Gala, a sea of tuxedos, silk gowns, and the sharp scent of competing pheromones. Before the accident, Brandon would have spent the evening on the opposite side of the ballroom, holding court with investors, while I stood near the bar like a piece of hired security. Tonight, he wouldn't go of my arm. "You're tense," Brandon whispered, leaning his head against my shoulder as we stood near the buffet. His scent was a warm, possessive cloud of jasmine that practically screamed claim to every alpha in the room. "It's a lot of people, Brandon," I said, adjusting my grip on his waist, "and you're being very vocal with your scent." He smirked, a predatory little curve of his lips. "Good. I want them to know. I'm tired of people looking at you like you're an available asset." The trouble started near the terrace. Elena, the daughter of a rival textile magnate, approached us. She was an alpha, sleek, ambitious, and someone I had gone to university with. She didn't know about the new Brandon. She only knew the rumors of our cold, transactional marriage. "Leave," she exclaimed, stepping a bit too close, her scent of sandalwood flaring in an intentional, flirtatious challenge. "I heard you were handling the new merger. We should grab a drink and discuss the logistics. My father is looking for a fresh perspective." She laid a hand on my forearm, her thumb grazing the fabric of my sleeve. The air next to me didn't just turn cold, it turned lethal. Before I could reply, Brandon moved. It wasn't a frantic movement. It was a slow, deliberate colonization of my space. He stepped between us, forcing Elena's hand to drop. He didn't look at her face, he looked at her throat. "He's married," Brandon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the vibration of a warning growl, a sound an omega should theoretically be incapable of making. Elena blinked, startled. "Brandon, we were just—" "I don't care what you were doing," Brandon interrupted. He reached back, grabbing my hand and interlacing our fingers, squeezing so hard my ring bit into my skin. "His fresh perspective belongs to me. If you want to discuss logistics, call his secretary. If you touch his arm again, I'll ensure your father's textile contracts are audited by morning." The room went silent. The clinking of crystal died down as the guests realized the Ice Queen was protecting her territory with a blowtorch. "Brandon," I whispered, trying to pull him back. "She didn't mean anything." He turned on me then, his eyes burning with a terrifying, raw intensity. "I don't care. I spent years—" He stopped, the fog of his amnesia momentarily clashing with a buried instinct. "I won't let them take you. Not now that I finally have you." He practically dragged me toward the elevators. Once the doors slid shut, he didn't wait for the car to move. He slammed his hand against the stop button and shoved me against the wall. His chest was heaving, his scent so thick it was almost intoxicating. "You're too handsome," he hissed, his hands trembling as they cut my face. "I hate the way they look at you. I hate that I have to share you with a room full of people who don't know the sound of your heartbeat." "Brandon, look at me," I said, grounding him with my voice. I wrapped my arms around his back, pulling him into a hard, grounding embrace. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm yours. I've always been yours." He let out a shaky breath, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He nipped at the skin there, not hard enough to break it, but enough to leave a mark. "Say it again," he murmured. "I'm yours. Proper. I am Leo and I belong entirely to Brandon." He finally relaxed, his body melting against mine. In that moment, held captive in a stopped elevator, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated happiness. Felt like a partner. I felt like a protector. I didn't notice the way Brandon winced slightly, his hand fluttering to his stomach for a brief, unconscious second. I didn't see the slight paleness of his skin that had nothing to do with the anger, and I didn't see the person standing in the hallway when the doors finally opened at the penthouse. Brandon's grandfather, holding a file that contained the truth about the money my father had stolen. The spring was almost over. Chapter 7. The sound of falling glass. The transition from the spring to the end began with a gift. I had spent weeks searching for it, 2 matching necklaces. They were simple, elegant platinum bands on a thin chain, engraved with our wedding date on the inside. Brandon had mentioned once, during a particularly clingy evening, that he wanted the world to know I was his, even when he wasn't there to growl at strangers. Matching accessories make it obvious, he had said, curled into my side, a mark for everyone to see. I had the box tucked into my inner coat pocket. It felt like a weight, but a hopeful one. Today was his birthday. Today, I was going to tell him that no matter what the doctors said about his memory, I was staying. The day started with a phone call from his grandfather's estate. "Brandon is here." The old man's voice had been gravelly, unreadable. He wanted to see the garden. "Come and get him for dinner, Leo." I drove out to the countryside, the air cooling as the city skyline faded into rolling hills. I felt a strange sense of peace. I imagined walking into the garden, handing him the box, seeing that radiant, amnesiac smile one more time. But when I arrived, the atmosphere was different. The house was silent. A maid pointed me toward the back terrace. I walked through the French doors, but Brandon wasn't in the garden. He was in the study, standing by the large oak desk. He had fallen. It wasn't a major accident. He had tripped over a rug near the heavy desk and struck his head against the edge of a bookshelf. His grandfather was hovering nearby, a glass of water in hand, but Brandon was motionless. "Brandon?" I rushed forward, my heart climbing into my throat. "Are you all right?" He was sitting in the armchair now, a small compress held to his temple. He didn't look up when I spoke. The silence in the room was absolute, but it wasn't the warm silence we had shared for months. It was the silence of a tomb. "Brandon?" I reached out to touch his shoulder. He flinched. It was a small movement, but it felt like a gunshot. He pulled away from my hand as if I were made of fire. Slowly, he raised his head. The pale, crystalline eyes were no longer soft. The spring was gone. The radiant, shamelessly attached boy had vanished, and in his place sat the Ice Queen, restored, sharpened, and freezing. "Don't," he said. The word was a razor blade. "You remember," I whispered, the box in my pocket suddenly feeling like a block of lead. "I remember everything," Brandon said. He stood up, his movements fluid and robotic. He looked at me with a disgust so visceral I felt my knees weaken. "The hospital. The way I followed you like a dog. The things I said to you." He let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You must have enjoyed it, Leo. Watching me make a fool of myself. Watching the man who despised you beg for your attention." "It wasn't like that," I said, my voice shaking. "You were happy, Brandon. We were happy. For the first time in 10 years, we weren't fighting ghosts. We weren't fighting ghosts because I didn't know I was living with a parasite." He snapped. He stepped closer, his scent returning to that bitter, frozen jasmine that burned my lungs. "I remembered the hallway, Lee. I remembered the money your father took. I remembered the divorce papers I signed because I couldn't stand the sight of you." Pulled the small velvet box from my pocket. It was a desperate move, a drowning man reaching for a straw. "It's your birthday," I said, my voice breaking. "I bought these. You said you wanted everyone to know I was yours. You said." "I said those things because I was brain damaged," Brandon roared. He reached out and swiped his hand through the air. He hit the box. It flew from my hand, skidding across the hardwood floor. The lid popped open, and the 2 platinum necklaces spilled out, glittering mockingly in the afternoon sun. Clink. The sound of the metal hitting the floor was the final punctuation mark on our spring. "Get out," Brandon whispered. "Go back to the penthouse and pack your things. My lawyers will contact you in the morning to finalize the filing." "Bran," I said. I looked at the necklaces on the floor. I looked at the man I loved, the man who only loved me when he didn't know who I was. I didn't pick up the jewelry. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the study, through the silent house, and into the cold evening air. He had chosen to remember, and in doing so, he had chosen to lose us. Chapter 8. The residual fever. Penthouse didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum dedicated to a dead civilization. Brandon had moved back into the west wing, sealing the door behind him like a barricade. The silence was no longer the comfortable, sleepy quiet of the last few months. It was thick and heavy, like the air before a terminal storm. He had filed the papers. Again. This time I didn't protest. I didn't beg. If he needed to be free of the parasite to breathe, I would give him the air. But as we moved through the final weeks of the legal cooling-off period, something began to happen. The Ice Queen was back, but his instincts were malfunctioning. I was standing in the kitchen making coffee. I knew when Brandon walked in. He was dressed for the office, a sharp, midnight blue suit, but his face was a shade of gray that made my stomach twist. He didn't look at me. He headed straight for the fridge. But halfway there, he stumbled. It was barely a trip, a momentary lapse in coordination, but I was moving before I could stop myself. I caught his elbow. "Brandon," he recoiled, his back hitting the marble island. "I told you not to touch me," he hissed, but the sting was gone from his voice. He looked faint, his pupils blown wide. "You're pale," I said, keeping my hands raised in a gesture of peace. "When was the last time you ate?" "None of your business. Stay in your wing. Leo, we have 14 days left until this is over." He tried to push past me, but a scent hit me. It was jasmine, yes, but underneath it was something new. Something milky, sweet, and incredibly fragile. It was a scent that made my alpha brain want to growl at the walls and build a nest in the middle of the living room. He didn't realize it, he didn't know yet, but his body was already signaling a change that neither of us was prepared for. That evening we had to attend one final mandatory banquet, a legacy event for the Grandfathers Foundation. We arrived in the same car, sitting on opposite sides of the leather bench, the silence between us a jagged canyon. "Don't speak unspoken to," Brandon muttered as we stepped onto the red carpet. "And for God's sake, stop looking at me with those pathetic eyes." "I'm just making sure you don't fall," I replied evenly. Inside the room was a shark tank of investors and old money. I stayed 2 steps behind him, playing the role of the dutiful, silent husband. But then, a young alpha from a rival firm, someone who had clearly heard the rumors of our impending divorce, approached me while Brandon was occupied with a board member. "Leo," the man purred, stepping into my personal space. He smelled of cheap cigars and arrogance. "Here, you'll be on the market soon. I've always admired your strategic mind. Perhaps we could discuss a new partnership over dinner next week." He reached out, his hand moving toward the small of my back. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto my shoulder with the force of an iron vice. Brandon had appeared out of nowhere. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his scent was a violent, protective explosion. "He's taken," Brandon said. The other alpha blinked, startled. "Brandon, I thought." "You thought wrong." Brandon stepped in front of me, his height barely reaching the other man's chin, yet he looked like he was ready to dismantle him. He placed a hand flat on my chest, a claim so ancient and primal it bypassed all his logic. "He is my husband. Until the day the judge signs the decree, his time, his mind, and his presence belong to me. If I see you near him again, I will ruin your firm's credit rating before the appetizers are served." The man scrambled away, muttering apologies. Brandon didn't let go of me. For a second, he leaned back against me, his head resting just below my chin. I could feel him trembling. "Brandon?" I whispered, my heart breaking for the man who hated me but couldn't let me go. He stiffened, realizing what he was doing. He ripped his hand away from my chest as if the fabric of my suit had burned him. "Don't misunderstand," he spat. Though he was breathless, his face flushed. "It's about the brand. I won't have people thinking my alpha can be picked up at a buffet like a cheap appetizer." He turned and walked away, his gait unsteady. I watched him go, the scent of that new jasmine lingering on my palm where he had touched me. He was leaving me, he was pushing me away with every word. But his soul was still screaming that I belonged to him. I didn't know then that the faintness wasn't just stress. Chapter 9. The verdict of the blood. The clinic was a place of sterile silence and white marble, tucked away in a private wing of the city's most exclusive hospital. We weren't here for a checkup. We were here to begin the severance, the medical suppression of our hormonal bond before the legal divorce was finalized. In our world, a bonded alpha and omega couldn't just walk away. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Brandon, in the chair opposite the doctor, his legs crossed, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He looked like a statue of a prince, but I could see the slight tremor in his fingers. I sat 3 feet away, an intruder in my own marriage. "Process is straightforward," the doctor said, glancing between us. "But before we administer the first round of suppressants to dissolve the scent bond, we must run a standard diagnostic panel. We cannot interfere with the endocrine system if there are any underlying irregularities." "Just do it," Brandon said, his voice clipped. "I have a board meeting at 4. The nurse took the samples. We sat in the heavy silence of the waiting room for 20 minutes. Brandon stared at a minimalist painting on the far wall. I stared at him. Stop it, he snapped, not turning his head. What? Looking at me like you're waiting for me to break. I'm fine, Leo. I'm better than I've been in months. You're pale, Brandon. You've lost weight. It's called the stress of getting rid of a mistake, he said. Before I could respond, the doctor returned. He wasn't carrying the suppressant vials. He was carrying a digital tablet, and his expression had shifted from clinical to profoundly cautious. Mr. Rossi, the doctor said, looking at Brandon, we cannot proceed with the severance. Brandon's eyes narrowed. Why not? If it's matter of fee? It's not the fee. The doctor turned the tablet around. The irregularity we found in your blood work isn't an illness. Your HCG levels are significantly elevated. You're nearly 8 weeks along. The air left the room. I felt the world tilt. 8 weeks. That meant the spring. The time when he followed me through the house, when he pulled me into the kitchen for midnight snacks, when he whispered that he'd choose me in every lifetime. Brandon didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the screen as if it were written in a language he didn't speak. No, he whispered. The pregnancy is stable, the doctor continued, oblivious to the carnage he was wreaking on our divorce plans. However, given the recent stress and the accident, we need to monitor you closely. The bond between an alpha and omega during gestation is vital for the fetus's development. Any attempt to dissolve the bond now would be catastrophic for the child. No, Brennan said again, louder this time. He stood up so abruptly the chair scraped harshly against the floor. That's impossible. I didn't mean for this. He turned his gaze toward me. It wasn't the look of a co-parent. It was the look of a man who had been trapped. You. Brandon, I didn't know, I said, standing up, my hands out instinctively. My alpha heart was thundering, wild, soaring joy clashing with a paralyzing fear. Child, my child, our child. Is this your plan? Brandon's scent turned into a jagged, panicked ice. Did you think that if you got me pregnant while I couldn't remember, you'd have a permanent leash on the Brandon fortune? Is this the ultimate transaction? The joy in my chest died instantly, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. I didn't plan anything, Brandon. I loved you. I thought you loved me back. I didn't love you. I was broken. He turned back to the doctor, his face white with a desperate kind of fury. I want to end it. The pregnancy, everything. I'm not carrying a child for a man who lied to me. The doctor looked uncomfortable. Mr. Rossi, that is your choice, of course. But I urge you to take 48 hours. The hormonal shift you're experiencing is intense. And, given your history, a termination could have complications for your future fertility. Brandon didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed his coat and bolted for the door, caught up to him in the parking garage. The air was cold, smelling of rain and exhaust. He was leaning against his car, his head down, breathing in jagged, shallow gasps. Brandon, I said softly, staying a respectful distance away. Don't come near me, he choked out. He looked up, and for the first time since the memory came back, I saw tears in his eyes. Not tears of sadness, tears of pure, unadulterated terror. You're letting me decide so easily? You're not even going to fight for it? Your heir to the empire? He heard rejection in my silence. He heard that I didn't care. I'm letting you decide because it's your body, I said, my voice thick with the effort of holding back my own grief. If you don't want to continue, I won't force you. I won't use a child to cage you. Brandon, I love you too much for that. Liars, he snapped. You're all liars. My father, your father, you. You just want what you can take. He got into the car, slammed the door. As he drove away, the scent he left behind wasn't the bitter jasmine of his hate. It was the scent of a frightened omega, crying out for his alpha to stop him from doing something he'd regret. I stood in the shadows of the garage and finally let the first tear fall. I had lost him when he remembered, and now I was losing the only part of our spring that was still real. Chapter 10. The truth in the rains. The days following the clinic were a blur of grey. I had moved into a hotel, unable to bear the weight of the silence in the penthouse. I left Brandon his space, but I stayed close enough to know he was safe. A shadow at the edge of his life, waiting for the blow that I knew was coming. I had already prepared my resignation from Brandon Group. If he was going to erase me, I wanted to make it easy for him. No ties, no anchors, no debts. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with us yet. Brandon had gone to the office to finalize the buyout of one of our subsidiaries. He was in the lobby, waiting for his car when he saw him. My father, ever the opportunist, had come to the building to demand another advancement on the merger funds. He didn't know Brandon's memory had returned. He thought he was still dealing with the soft, amnesiac omega who smiled at everyone. Brandon, my favorite son-in-law, my father boomed, approaching him with a hand outstretched. Brandon stiffened, his eyes turning to flint. "Mr. Rossi, you're a long way from your failing construction sites." My father laughed, oblivious to the frost. Now, no need for the cold shoulder. "I just came to discuss the next phase of the consultation fee. Leo mentioned you were being quite generous during your recovery." Brandon's scent sharpened, a warning hiss of jasmine. "Generous? You mean the money you extorted from my family while I was incapacitated? The money you used to buy your way out of bankruptcy?" My father's smile faltered. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Extorted? That's a harsh word for a business arrangement. Leo and I had a deal. I gave him the connection he's wanted since high school, and you gave me the capital. Everyone got what they wanted." Brandon felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Leo had a deal with you, of course. Why do you think he was so eager to sign?" My father chuckled, a sound like gravel in a blender. "The boy was half-starved for you. Told him if he signed the papers, I'd make sure your grandfather pushed you into the marriage. He didn't care about the cost, mostly because it wasn't his money." Brandon felt his world tilt. He knew about the money. "He knew I needed a bailout," my father said, waving a hand dismissively. "He didn't know the exact figure. I kept the specifics from him to keep his alpha pride intact. But he knew the marriage was the price of my survival, and he paid it gladly to get you in his bed." It was a half-truth, the most dangerous kind of lie. My father made it sound like I had brokered the deal, rather than being the collateral for it. Brandon's face went white. The betrayal he had felt for months finally crystallized into something sharp and jagged. "Get out," he whispered. "Excuse me, get out of my building." Brandon's cracked like a whip. "And tell your son that if I see either of you again, I will burn what's left of your reputation to the ground." I was in my hotel room, packing the last of my things, when the call came. It wasn't Brandon. It was the office security. "Mr. Rossi, there's been an accident." "Mr. Brandon." He was arguing with someone in the lobby. He turned to walk away, his foot caught on the marble edge of the fountain, and fell down the stairs. My heart stopped. He's conscious, but he's in a lot of pain. We're headed back to the same clinic." I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I grabbed my keys and drove like a man possessed. All I could think about was the doctor's warning. The bond is vital for the fetus. A shock could be catastrophic. When I arrived, the clinic was a hive of activity. I pushed past the nurses, my alpha scent flaring in a desperate, protective wave. I found him in the emergency bay. Brandon was lying on the gurney, his face drenched in sweat, his hands clutching his stomach. His scent was a frantic, dying scream of jasmine, the scent of an omega who was losing everything. "Brandon," I reached him, ignoring the nurses trying to hold me back. He looked up at me, and for the first time, there was no hate in his eyes, only a raw, naked terror. "Leo," he gasped, his fingers digging into my arm with bruising force. I said I didn't want it. I told the doctor I wanted it to end. "Don't say that," I whispered, pressing my forehead against his. "Don't say that. It's my fault," he sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. "I was so angry. I was so focused on the lies that I didn't protect it. Leo, please, don't let it go." The doctor stepped in, his face grim. "We need to move him. The pregnancy is at high risk. 4 weeks, Leo. If we can get through the next 4 weeks of complete bed rest and stabilization, we might save it. But he needs his alpha, he needs the bond." Brandon's grip on my hand didn't loosen. He looked at me, his pride finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Say," he whispered, "I'm not going anywhere, I promised," my voice breaking. "I'm right here." The 4 weeks of fear had begun. Chapter 11. The 4-week vigil. The clinical world of the hospital was replaced by the suffocating silence of the penthouse's west wing. Brandon couldn't stay in a hospital. The press was already circling like vultures, sensing blood in the water of the Brandon Group's leadership. So we turned the master suite into a medical sanctuary. The instructions were simple and brutal: complete bed rest, no stress, no work, no movement that wasn't strictly necessary, and most importantly, constant proximity to my scent. For the first 48 hours, we didn't speak. I moved into a small armchair by the window, a silent sentry. I watched the IV drip and the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. Brandon stayed turned away from me, a silhouette of misery under the silk sheets. By the second week, the physical toll began to show. Brandon, once the master of his own universe, was reduced to a state of total vulnerability. He was nauseous, exhausted, and haunted by his own words at the clinic. I became his ghost. I cooked the bland meals the doctor prescribed. I carried him to the bathroom when he was too weak to walk. I worked from my laptop in the corner of the room, keeping the company running from the shadows so he wouldn't have to worry about the board of directors. One night the fever peaked. Brandon was tossing, his skin slick with sweat, his scent turning into a distressed, jagged spike of jasmine. "Leo," he whimpered in his sleep. "Don't." "The money." I didn't mean. I was by the bed in a second. I didn't care about his rules anymore. I sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled him into my arms. He was burning. Instinctively, I let my alpha pheromones flood the room, thick, grounding cedar and warm earth. He didn't pull away. He collapsed to my chest, his fingers clutching my shirt as if it were a life raft. "I'm here," I whispered into his hair. "I'm right here, Brandon." I saw him, Brandon rasped, his eyes fluttering open, glazed with fever and tears. "Your father," he said. "He said you brokered the deal, that you bought me." The air in my lungs turned to lead. "I didn't broker anything, Brandon. I knew he was in trouble. I knew he wanted the merger to save himself, but I didn't know he was holding you for ransom. I signed because I was selfish. I signed because for 10 years, I've been looking for a way back to that hallway to tell you I was a coward." Brandon looked up at me, the pale light of the moon catching the wetness on his cheeks. "He lied to me about you knowing. He lied to both of us," I said. "He used my love for you and your grandfather's love for mine as a weapon." I cut him off, Brandon. I returned every cent of the fee from my own savings and the sale of my grandfather's land. I have nothing left but my name and a job I'm ready to quit. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't cold. It was the silence of two people standing in the ruins of a city, realizing the war was over. Brandon reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the gold ring still on my finger. "I said I didn't want the he whispered, his voice breaking. "When I felt the blood, when I was on the stairs, I thought God was punishing me for being so cruel. I thought I had killed the only part of you that was still pure." "You didn't kill anything," I said, pulling him tighter. "It's a fighter, just like you." By the third week, the Ice Queen had dissolved into something raw and soft. Brandon started asking me to stay in the bed with him, not for sex, but for the scent. He would curl into my side, his head tucked under my chin, and let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. "Tell me about high school," he murmured one afternoon. "The truth. Not the version you told Julian." I told him everything. The way I used to wait by the bike racks just to see his car pull out. The way I had kept a dried jasmine flower in my textbook for 3 years. The way my heart had shattered when I saw him hear my lie in the hallway. "I hated you because I thought you were bored of me," Brandon confessed, his voice muffled against my chest. "I thought you were this brilliant, perfect alpha who saw me as just another spoiled omega. I wanted to hurt you because you were the only person who could make me feel small." "We're both idiots," I laughed softly, kissing the top of his head. "Yes," he agreed, his hand resting tentatively on the slight swell of his stomach. "But at least we're together now." The end of the 4th week arrived. The doctor to the house, his ultrasound machine in tow. Brandon held my hand so hard his knuckles were white. The gel was cold. The room was quiet, and then thump thump. Thump thump, thump thump. The sound of a tiny frantic heartbeat filled the room. The doctor smiled, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. "The pregnancy is stable. The hematoma has cleared. You're out of the danger zone, Mr. Rossi." Brandon burst into tears. He didn't hide them. He didn't turn away. He turned into me, sobbing with a relief so profound it shook both of us. I looked at the screen, at the tiny flickering light that represented our future. I had loved him without memory. I had loved him through his hate. And now I would love him through the life we were building. The 4 weeks of fear were over. The rest of our lives was just beginning. Chapter 12. The chosen mark. The boardroom of Brandon Group was silent, a stark contrast to the chaos of a month ago. The air was no longer sterile. It carried a faint, grounded scent of cedar and a warm, blossoming jasmine. Brandon stood at the head of the table. He was thinner than before, but the frailty had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength. He wasn't wearing his midnight blue armor today. He wore a soft cream-colored suit, and around his neck, visible above the collar of his silk shirt, was the platinum necklace I had bought for his birthday. I sat to his right not as a consultant, but as his husband. Around my own neck, identical and warm against my skin, was its twin. "The merger is finalized," Brandon announced, his voice steady as he looked at the board members. "There are internal changes. My husband, Leo, will be stepping into the role of Chief Operating Officer, not because of a contract, not because of a family pact, but because he is the only person I trust with the future of this company." One of the older directors cleared his throat. "Mr. Brandon, there have been rumors about the stability of the marriage, about a divorce filing." Brandon didn't flinch. He reached out under the table and found my hand, interlacing our fingers. He brought our joined hands up, resting them on the mahogany surface for everyone to see. The gold bands caught the light. "The filing has been withdrawn," Brandon said, his gaze sweeping the room with a challenge. "I loved Leo once when I lacked the memory of our pain. I hated him when the lies of others became my truth. But today I choose him with my eyes wide open. We are not a transaction. We are a family. Later that evening, the penthouse felt different. The wings abolished. The doors were all open, letting the sunset light spill from the east to the west. I was in the nursery we had begun to design, looking at a crib made of light oak. I felt a pair of arms wrap around my waist from behind. Brandon leaned his forehead against my shoulder blade, letting out a soft, contented sigh. "You're thinking again," he murmured. "Can smell the gears grinding." I turned in his arms, pulling him flush against me. I let my hand rest on the now noticeable curve of his stomach. The life inside him kicked, a small, rhythmic thud that felt like a miracle every time. "I was just thinking about that whole way," I admitted. "How much time we wasted because we were both too proud to be vulnerable." Brandon looked up at me. The icy distance in his eyes had been replaced by a radiant, deep-seated warmth. He reached up, his fingers tracing the platinum chain around my neck. "We didn't waste it," he said softly. "We were just taking the long way home. If I hadn't lost my memory, I might never have lowered my guard enough to see the man you actually are. And if you hadn't stayed through my hate, I would never have known what it felt like to be truly loved." He leaned in, whispering against my lips, "You're mine, Leo, not because of a grandfather's promise, not because of a debt. You're mine because I won't have it any other way." "And you're mine," I replied, kissing him with a slow, deep certainty. "Every version of you, the ice, the spring, and everything in between." The sun dipped below the skyline, casting the room in a golden glow. The world outside was still loud, still complicated, and still full of people who didn't understand us. But inside these walls, the scent was perfect. He loved me once without memory. He hated me because of lies. He chose me again knowing the truth. And this time, as I felt the heartbeat of our child against my palm and the warmth of my husband in my arms, I finally believed it. We were playing. The Jasmines of June. The penthouse was no longer a silent museum of marble and glass. It had been conquered by a new, tiny sovereign. I stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching the morning sun filter through the sheer curtains. The room smelled of lavender, milk, and the deep, grounding scent of home. Brandon was sitting in the rocking chair, his head leaned back, eyes closed. Tucked into the crook of his arm was Junie, a bundle of soft blankets and tufts of dark hair that she had definitely inherited from me. She was 3 months old, and she already had the Brandon glare whenever her bottle was 30 seconds late. I walked over quietly, but Brandon's eyes flickered open. He didn't look tired, he looked complete. "She finally fell asleep," he whispered, a small, triumphant smirk on his lips. "She's a stubborn one, Leo. Just like her alpha father. I think the stubbornness comes from the Omega who refused to let me into his wing for 6 months." I teased, leaning down to kiss his forehead. Brandon reached up, his hand lingering on the back of my neck, his fingers brushing the platinum chain of the necklace he never took off. He pulled me down for a soft, lingering kiss, one that tasted of caffeine and contentment. "Fair point," he murmured. Junie made a small, snuffling sound in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching out to grab the silk of Brandon's shirt. We both froze, holding our breath until she settled back into a deep slumber. I sat on the ottoman at Brandon's feet, resting my hand on his knee. I looked at the two of them, the boy I wasn't supposed to love and the daughter I never thought I'd have. "I saw the news this morning," I said quietly. "The merger is breaking records. The board is calling you the most influential CEO of the decade." Brandon looked down at Junie, then back at me. He reached out and interlaced his fingers with mine, our wedding bands clicking softly together. "Let them talk," Brandon said, his voice thick with a warmth that the public would never see. "The board can have the influence. I have everything I need right here." He leaned his head against mine, the scent of jasmine and cedar finally perfectly balanced. "Happy anniversary, Leo." "Happy anniversary, Brandon." The long winter was over. The spring had become a permanent season, and as Junie dreamed in the arms of the man who chose to love me twice, I knew that for the first time in my life, the silence was exactly where it was meant to be.